Well, praise the Lord. Praise the Lord, National Association, and all of our guests and all of our friends. Welcome to the second pre-camp meeting conference of the National Association of the Church of God. We hope that everyone is doing well. We know that there was a storm that passed through many of our communities. We pray that everyone is doing well and that you're holding up well along with your families. Tonight, like last night, is going to be worth your time. I would encourage you, if you know somebody that did not see last night or has not registered for tonight, I would encourage you to get them on the phone, give them a call, tell them they need to register and they need to link into this webinar. Tonight's webinar is on mental health and the church. God is concerned about our well-being on all levels, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And tonight, it's going to be a subject that everyone should be able to identify. We've all had challenges, and as we've gone through this time of pandemic, being shut in, and folks are concerned about going back to work and concerned about going back to church, and this is a subject that we all need to hear, so that the church is equipped to minister to its constituents, its communities. We need the skills and the knowledge and the understanding for our own personal well-being, as well as for the personal well-being of others. And so we want to welcome you. Tonight, we are blessed to have a tremendous panel. We have an excellent moderator, amen, in JoAnna Durham. She's going to be our moderator tonight. She is a member of the Celebration Church there in Columbia, Maryland. She grew up in Anderson, Indiana, and she was a member there of Sherman Street Church of God. She's married for 30 years, I understand, has 3 kids. She has gone and prepared herself, and she is really the person to be the moderator tonight. She has a BA in psychology, a master's in social work from Howard University. She is a certified practitioner, trainer, educator under several state boards in the mental health field. She is indeed a gift to her church and a gift to her community. She currently works at the Baltimore County Public School System. And so I'm going to place you in her efficient hands, and she's going to lead us in this, again, a very timely subject, the church and mental health. God bless you. Oh yeah, JoAnna.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that introduction. So welcome everybody, and tonight we are excited to have our conversation about mental health. But the first thing I would like to do is I would like to introduce our panelists. So first we have Dr. Julio Orozco. Dr. Julio holds a doctorate of education from Argosy University, Washington, D.C., in counseling, education, and supervision. He's been in the counseling field since 2007. He has worked with family systems, at-risk youth, substance abuse, career counseling, and other populations in counseling. Dr. Orozco has worked as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. He is currently the Director of Clinical Training and Field Placement, Assistant Professor of Mental Health Counseling, and KCREP Liaison for Nyack College, Alliance Graduate School of Counseling in New York City. He is also an ordained minister and a senior pastor of Grace Community Church in Georgetown, Maryland since 2009. Welcome. Our next panelist is Maisha Mcintyre. Maisha is a licensed professional clinical counselor with supervision designation. She has a bachelor's degree in human resources from Mount Union College and a master's degree in community counseling from John Carroll University. For over 10 years, she has worked with both children and adults, providing currently sensitive mental health services in the area of depression, anxiety, trauma, bereavement, mood disorders, and ADHD. She is currently employed full-time as at a community mental health agency called Minority Behavior Health in Akron, Ohio. Maisha approach to counseling is a holistic one that is based on cognitive behavioral therapy. Her goal is to help clients realign their thoughts, actions, and behaviors in a way that incorporates their own values, goals, and cultural belief. Welcome.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Dr. Tony. Dr. Tony is the Dean of AGSC and Program Director of the Mental Health Counseling Program at Nyack College, Alliance Graduate School of Counseling. Dr. Tony is a graduate of Regent University, where she obtained her PhD in psychology and counseling with a specialization in counselor education and supervision. Also receiving a duo degree, MS in bilingual education and bilingual school psychology from Fordham University in New York City, while she worked for NYS Department of Education for 10 years and pursuing her doctorate. Dr. Tony also specializes in research and study of sexual abuse and victimization. Her passion for counseling and spiritual well-being comes on the heels of her own childhood trauma, which has been her catalyst in becoming the woman she is today. Dr. Tony has found her passion and purpose advocating for those that come across her path. And last but not least, our last panelist is Norman Robinson. Professor Robinson is the Director of Care Integration and Helping Up Missions in Baltimore, Maryland. Helping Up Missions is a 550-bed Christian, biblically based residential drug and alcohol recovery program. Professor Norman joined Helping Up Ministry in 2019 and oversees the treatment team of certified peer recovery specialists and program managers who guide over 500 clients through the spiritual recovery programs. Professor Norman is passionate about helping men and women help from their broken lives that have led to addiction and other destructive behaviors. Professor Norman has dedicated himself to improving the standard of client care at several programs, serving the homeless, substance abuse, and HIV populations. Professor Norman is in the process of joining us this evening. He's having a few technical difficulties, but prayerfully he'll be with us in just a moment. So again, welcome everybody to our discussion for this evening. Our goal today is to have a conversation about mental health in the church as it relates to people of color. We want to examine mental health by looking in the rearview mirror of the past, examine the current realities and its impact on our minority communities. So let's get started. First question, first I would like to let the audience know that if you have any questions, please add them in our question and answer chat. And that way we will do our best to get to your questions. It really depends on our timing, but we will do our best to include your questions in our discussion for this evening. Okay? So our first question for our panelists. What would you say is important for us to know about how the church has thought about and responded to the area of mental health in the past that continues to impact us today? Anyone can start.
I'll start. Is it okay if I'll start?
Thank you.
I do have some slides. Can I go ahead and share the screen and bring those up?
Sure.
I don't think it said it. Oh, there comes Professor Norman. Okay. Oh, it said the screen sharing is disabled.
Okay. Can you just share them with us?
Yes, I can. So when we think about, I'm going to start off by saying that my approach to this was from the African-American perspective. I am an African-American female. I go to a predominantly African-American church. I work with the African-American population. So that was the frame that I came from. And that's how I'm approaching the answers to these questions. So when I looked at that first question in terms of the church and our history in mental health, I had to think about where our history in this country started. So, and unfortunately, our history in this country started with trauma. We weren't always slaves, and we know that. We didn't start out as slaves, but in this country, that's where we pretty much started, and we have a history of being brought over here against our will, generation after generation of brutality, violence, inhumane treatment, being treated as less than human. And after slavery ended, it didn't stop there. Of course, we had the Jim Crow, sharecropping, chain gangs, through the civil rights movement and the brutality and efforts that we had there, moving on into what we're currently dealing with now, which is the police brutality that we're seeing everywhere you turn. You can't miss it. Systemic racism, the over-incarceration of our population. Basically, we have a long and unfortunate history of trauma in this country. And in addition to that history, we are constantly told to let it go, to forget about it. Why are we still talking about this? This is old history. We had a Black president. Everything's great now. Why are we still talking about old news? But as those of us that deal with trauma know, that's not something you can just let go and just move on past, especially when it's continuing to happen every day. So where the church fits into that is that it's always been our safe place. For years in this country, it's been where we can go to be safe, to be nurtured, to feed our souls, to worship. It's our place of refuge. It's our community. It's where we witness each other's testimonies, where we witness each other being healed, where we see our struggles, we hold each other up in our struggles. It's been our refuge, and it's been the main point of contact in the African-American community. Now, some people may argue that, well, people aren't going to church as much as they used to, and that's true to some extent. But when you compare the African-American population with most other populations in this country, we are still have a higher rate of church going, church attendance, and religious belief than most other demographics. That has not changed. So that's kind of where I'm trying to put it all together here. So when we talk about mental health, so we talked about our history in this country and the trauma that we've endured. We've talked about where the church has stood. And then we look at our health system for us, for minorities, for Blacks. There's never been a history where we've been equal, where we've received equal treatment. Our African-American men in particular have the worst health outcomes of any major demographic group. We tend to be inaccurately diagnosed, not just with mental health, but with physical health. And we also utilize mental health services at about half the rate of Caucasian Americans. So there's a mistrust of the health system in this country, and for good reason. And I'm sure some of our other panelists can talk about that. So where does that leave us? So for us, where we go is the church. That's where we go. We go there first, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, it's not a bad thing. It is what it is. It's what's worked for us. But the question is, what stops us when we're in the church from reaching out for help, for mental health help? So what I have seen in my practice and from working with others is that there are a couple things that when those of us that are in the church and Christians and embedded there are a couple worries that we see. One is that people worry that it's going to be seen as a lack of faith or a lack of spiritual strength. If they admit that they're struggling, if people admit that we have problems, that we're not doing as well as we should be doing or we think we should be doing, then it means that prayer hasn't worked for us.
Mm-hmm.
I had a quote here that said, whether it's in terms of freedom from physical bondage, spiritual bondage, or mental bondage, faith has been viewed as the key to unlock the shackles. Within the African-American community, there was often a belief that no matter how great the burden, prayer was the answer. And I still believe prayer is the answer. I'm not here to say prayer is not the answer, but I do believe that the answer to prayer can be going to see a therapist or going to the doctor or going to see a psychiatrist. So I feel that it's very important that the church is sensitive to how it approaches and discusses mental health issues.
I'm gonna jump on. I'm gonna piggyback on Maisha. Correct?
Yes.
I appreciate everything that you stated in how how the church even understands mental health illness, specifically from our past history. But I'm a person. I'm wired in a way that I have to make sense of what I'm trying to say. And so for me, I think one of the most important things, besides everything that my sister just expressed, is to even teach our congregants what is mental illness. I mean, we can absolutely delve into, the history, and it's all part of the dilemma that we face, that the church faces today. And one of the biggest dilemmas, I believe, is that the church is untaught. They don't know even how to identify mental illness. So I also have a little PowerPoint presentation that I presented back in 2016, and it's mental illness and the church, or in the church. And one of the first questions I say is, mental illness, what you see and what you do not see. So then what is mental illness? And sometimes it boils down to what we don't want to see, right? And what are we denying or ignoring? So just to give a little cap on mental illness as a whole, mental illnesses are health conditions involving significant changes in our thinking, in our emotions, and our behaviors. Sometimes it is a combination of all three. Mental illnesses are associated with distress and or problems functioning in society, your workplace, your home, and definitely with your family, within family activities. One of the things that I like to discuss is, how does the church view or perceive mental illness? Well, on my PowerPoint is a big yellow word called stigma. And so the church, the history of the church, I'm not, let me preface by saying I am not a theologian. I don't know much about hermeneutics and homiletics. Dr. O, did I get those right? But I do know, even from my own experience, that the church is unlearned when it comes to this major topic of mental illness. And so the church's attitude and beliefs are expressed negatively towards mental illness and mental health, right? And it has become a stigma. It's a taboo. We're not even supposed to talk about it. So a stigma is a cluster of negative attitudes and beliefs that actually actually motivate fear, rejection, avoidance, and even discrimination against people with mental illness. And I think that as a church, as the body of Christ, we need to start opening our eyes, and we need to start teaching, because really, in essence, what it takes is education, right? Educating people. But I know from past experiences in the church that mental illness has always been a taboo. Basically, what we're told to do is pray about it, fast about it, get into your word. You know, it's funny, yesterday I had a situation with a student that a professor CC'd me on her email, and she titled the email, I just can't do this. And as I read the email, I was kind of nervous, and I found exactly what I feared, which was suicidal ideation. And I immediately called her, and I had to assess the suicidal ideation, which means thinking about suicide, and possibly not having made an attempt. Thank God she had not made an attempt. But one of the things I know about this precious young student is that she's pretty hyper spiritual. So everything, the answer is, you know, from a spiritual standpoint, which I don't have a problem with. But it's funny because when I was talking to her, I did say, listen, God already knows what you're going through. We're actually not going to pray right now. We're going to start thinking about a plan to keep you safe and keep you from harm. And so we pretty much went through a list of things that she agreed to do, including, if these thoughts continue, that she would walk herself into an emergency room or call 911. So my point with that little story is, and I'm with Maisha, absolutely 100%. I believe in prayer. I believe in breaking bondages in the name of Jesus. I believe in generational curses. That's what the word teaches us. But I also feel that the church is one-sided, only the spiritual and nothing about the mental status. So I absolutely appreciate this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Norman Robinson, I just want to say welcome.
Thank you. I have myself on mute. Thank you.
And we're glad that you joined us this evening. Is there anything that you would like to add to the question responding to how the church's outlook on mental health has impacted us today?
Sure. It's a great question. You know, I really enjoyed thinking about it, and I talked to one of my colleagues, a really close colleague, about it. And you know, so I'm going to give you a kind of a summary of our conversation about it. And it basically is that in the past, the church has thought about mental health as a spiritual condition that needed to be explored or treated through prayer, confession, healing, altar calls, healing services, and even from a standpoint of demonic oppression.
Mm-hmm.
And the worst thing is, in my opinion, is when the individual is struggling with a mental health issue, is told that they need to have more faith if they want to be healed. Now, this can often be accompanied by quoting of scriptures to support the position of the church or the denomination or the thinking of the minister or clergy person that's addressing the issue. Now, like my colleagues both said, I'm not attacking any person or church or denomination for those convictions and beliefs, because because I have those same beliefs. I'm a born again believer and believe definitely in the power of prayer, healing, and Jesus Christ as able to heal. I've even gone through my own dark emotional periods in my life where my faith was the only thing that pulled me through. There was times when I was feeling depressed, having panic attacks, and I couldn't pray for myself, but just holding the Bible would calm me down, would help soothe me, and help me regain a sense of control and normalcy in my life. And in a similar way, I don't think that's different from a lot of Christians, a lot of people of faith. And in a similar way, being in church at a regular Sunday service or worshiping or hearing the word preached has been an incredible source of comfort and strength and relief from sadness, anxiety, and fear. But then I thought about the original condition still remained. So when people leave that environment, that atmosphere, that makes sense to me that when you are hearing the word or when you're worshiping, you should feel better. You should expect relief, and God's presence and power is real. But the condition that created those symptoms, oftentimes people go back and have to go back to the conditions and the environments and the situations that created that. So how do we help, and what do we do as a church and as people of faith in helping people to balance that, their spirit, the power of their faith and their trust and faith in God, and the reality of their lives that create these symptoms and these mental health issues. And I was thinking that the human being is not a spiritual being only, but they are physical, psychological, and social beings. People have many important needs beyond their spiritual existence. So like when Jesus told Satan that man cannot live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God, he affirmed that we're spiritual beings and creations and must have an active and growing spiritual faith to live in this fallen world. When Jesus said that if a man gains the whole world but loses his soul, he was again speaking about the significance of this immaterial nature of man, our spirit and soul, as being essential to a person's ultimate well-being and wellness. And Jesus also talked about belief, that there were times when Jesus was not able to heal people, although he had the power and desire to heal it because of their lack of belief. So taking all that into consideration, what is this soul? And it's our mind, our will, our emotions that need to be restored. And that's the part of us that interacts with this world, our soul. So even God, looking at Adam, said it was not good for man to be alone, and he was in a perfect walk and relationship with God. So likewise, I submit that the church's role in the response to mental health issues is to take a holistic approach to providing comfort, support, rest, recovery, and healing to its members and to the sheep. People are not designed by God to live alone, but to be in relationship with. Relationships are important. God created us in relationships. Like, I think neurologists say that 2/3 of our brain is devoted to relationships, to being relational beings. So God wants us to have relationships with him, with our communities of faith, with our families, our friends, and our larger community. And I and many of my colleagues that feel that in our conversation that our churches have come, I think, quite far in their openness to seeking mental health services for themselves and for their members. And as a matter of fact, I have dealt with and treated dozens of people for mental health services who were pastors and their families, and counseled dozens of pastors and family members. And I found it to be both refreshing and sometimes, quite honestly, shocking to me to see the willingness and openness with which they shared real things, real pain, real trauma, and real hurt that was troubling them and troubling their families. And I found them to be incredibly transparent and honest and vulnerable in talking about those emotional and mental health needs. And there was no spiritualizing of the problems and issues, but a directness and a candor about getting into what is happening to the person seeking treatment. So as I was talking to my friend about this, we were thinking about it, and we said, well, we attribute that in part to the recognition that the pastor, the minister, and their family are very much people of faith and devotion to God. But despite this, they are just like any other human being who must deal with multiple stressors that affect them and their families. And another possible factor in pastors and clergy seeking mental health services is because of the great burden and stress that is placed upon them and their families as a reality of ministry. Pastors and clergy are often the first people that people of faith seek for help and support when they are experiencing grief, loss, trauma, and emotional and mental distress. And people who are in ministry, those of you who are in ministry, know better than anyone else how many clergy leave the ministry every year due to emotional stress and burnout. So it's for these reasons and others that I believe that the church has such an important role in promoting mental health awareness and counseling for themselves and their members. It is a part of the overall purpose and calling to serve the people of God that mandates a mental health approach in this time that we're living in now. So that's my thoughts on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Orozco, would you like to add to that?
I'd like to add very briefly, as my colleagues have done such an excellent job of laying down the groundwork. What I would like to contribute to this question is the fact that I believe the church has been reactionary at times in extremes. So as it's been said before, everything's a demon, everything's a spirit, everything. And it doesn't allow for folks to conceptualize the issues that are going on with people that are part of the body to be anything other than spiritual. And on the other side of that, you might have folks that say, well, we don't need psychology and science and all these things. We can do away with that because we're people of faith. And so I think that these extreme responses are to our detriment, because I believe, as Professor Robinson said, God has made us relational, rational, volitional, emotional. And I really like the Latin phrase cura personalis, to be entrusted to care for the whole person. That I believe Jesus Christ's work on the cross was not just to redeem and heal us spiritually, but physically, emotionally, and all other aspects of our lives. I think it's a complete and whole work. But I think a very important piece is to start with the correct diagnosis. There are issues that are inherently spiritual, and no amount of theory and modality is going to undo the work of the enemy when he has a foothold or when he has influence in someone's life. On the other hand, we can do a great harm if we diagnose someone as this is an issue of spiritual battle and liberation, and it isn't, and it's mental health. And so those pieces are important. And the last thing I will say is I encourage the church to redig her wells of revival, because originally the care for those in our society that were suffering from mental health started with the church. It started centuries ago. And because of our inherent value on all human life, because of the imago Dei of God imprinted on every one of us, the care was done in a humane and a way that preserved dignity. However, when that was relinquished and taken out of the hands of the church, and it was taken over by the government and the secular world, and by the way, I will say this, I struggle with those words, secular and sacred. I do believe that God in Jesus Christ brings all these things together, and what makes a work sacred or secular is who you're doing it for. So I believe there are pastors that preach from the pulpit and are being very secular because of who they're doing it for. And I believe that a custodian doing his work as unto the Lord is making it sacred. So I will say this, when the government started to take care of those disenfranchised and struggling with mental health, one of the things that started to happen was that value and dignity was lost. The value of Imago Dei was no longer undergirding that work. And in fact, what started to happen in Europe in around the 19th, 18th century was that they started to charge admission so the general public could come in and watch those struggling with acute mental illnesses manifest their behaviors. And they were turning a profit off of it. And so that my encouragement is, let's have accurate diagnosis. Let's understand that we are holistic beings, and let's dig up those wells of revival, many areas that the church perhaps has relinquished over time, that we can lay hold of again through the empowering of the Holy Spirit, but also through accurate knowledge and use of theory and modality. Thank you.
Thank you. You mentioned, Dr. Orozco, a little bit about mental issues and spiritual issues. We had a question come in, and the question is there a way to distinguish between a mental issue and a spiritual issue?
Well, I can share from experiences that I've had, both in my role as a pastor and as my role as a counselor. I share this experience with you not as a hard and fast rule or the only way of determining. However, it's been my experience that when I have dealt with folks that were demon possessed and were in need of liberation in that way, they were aware of what was going on with them. They would be able to identify, you know, I am hearing this, I'm experiencing this, this is not me. However, in clinical work, when I've dealt with folks that have acute mental illnesses and they're dealing, say, with something like paranoid schizophrenia or other Axis 2 diagnosis, they are not aware. They are not aware of their behaviors and what's going on. And so I would put that out there as a somewhat of a litmus test to begin to peel back the layers and determine. And I also would caution us to make it a dichotomy, saying it's either that, it's this or that, because again, as whole beings, we're also integrated beings. And there is a flow back and forth in the identities we hold. And so, but that's one thing that I would say. A lot of folks that are experiencing demonic oppression, they're able to verbalize that and be able to say, you know, an entity outside or other than myself or an influence, and can explain it. A person that is dealing with paranoid schizophrenia, they don't realize what's happening and what they're doing and what they're saying. There is no self-awareness in that regard.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to respond to that question?
If I could add to that, I would agree with what Dr. Orozco said. However, just to kind of fill it out a little bit more, I'm thinking more in terms of things like depression and anxiety, and people not having the energy or the ability to exercise their faith. There are times when someone is so depressed that they may not have the energy to pray, or they may not have the energy to get out of bed or eat or bathe. So I agree with, I'm not disagreeing with anything Dr. Orozco is saying, but I agree that there's two parts to it, because our faith is always important, but there can be a point where you're so sick that you're not able to exercise your faith. So the mental health aspect of that is important, because once you can get more energy, more help in that way, then you can add your faith in as another tool. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes, definitely. It definitely goes together. Thank you. What would you say is important for us to know and understand about the current realities in our families, congregations, and communities as it relates to mental health? And how might you see the pandemic and the protests and the social injustice and the social unrest impacting mental health?
Well, I'm just going to jump in and share my personal experience during this time. I actually just wrote to my pastor this morning because he wrote us a letter saying that we were not going to open the church up until the end of this year, 2020. So when I wrote him, I did thank him for caring for his sheep, you know, the sheep. I'm one of his sheep. But I also said, you know, Pastor, I'm an optimistic late bloomer. And I wasn't sure if he understood what I was saying. So I proceeded to explain. And I said, you know, I usually don't, like, my brain is wired not to see the negative right away. I've always, you know, look for the best part of a human being, the best part of a scenario or situation. When something is bad, I always go to, well, what's the worst case scenario? And I had to admit to him today, I said, but you know, after all these months being home, I think I'm beginning to feel the weariness. It's taken me a little while. At first, I was like, I like being home. I like my house. I like where I live, you know, in the country. I'm like, this is great. I don't have to go into New York City. But all of a sudden, I have been experiencing some anxiety, almost feeling like, how can I really do my job so far away from my students and my work? And so that's just me. Thankfully, I have practiced for many years. I'm much older than you might think. And I've been practicing for many years, you know, how to navigate through my anxiety and all of those circumstantial emotions that come up. But I, you know, like that student yesterday with the suicidal ideation, you know, I believe that people are being so affected in such grave, on such grave levels. You know, young people are beginning to ask, what does my future hold for me? I have a granddaughter in college that just broke down recently to me and said, Mama, what does the future hold for me? I'm doing all this college thing. Like, they're feeling hopeless, let alone the anxiety, possibly, you know, the impulsivity to go out and do and gather. And then, you know, we're dealing with these every day, a new surge in the city, in our states. And so how is this impacting us? I think it's even getting to the best of us, you know, that know what this is all about, that know mental health and strategies and treatment and books, and, you know, it's getting to everyone. So imagine how it's affecting the church today.
I think we can share our screens now.
Yes, we can.
Yay. So I'm going to show a couple of the slides that I had to try to answer this question. So this is a slide that I put in here because I feel like for African Americans, this is always in the background for us. And we are often kind of disregarded or told to let it go, or why are we still talking about this? And it fits into the question even that we have right now, which is, how is our community being impacted? And so I look at this, and this is so interesting, as Dr. Tony said, because it's one of the few times as a mental health practitioner, I am counseling people through the same thing that I'm going through.
Yeah.
And it's great because I can understand where people are coming from, but at the same time, some days it's like, oh my gosh. So I call this the perfect storm, which, you know, we have this global pandemic, and as an African-American female, we know that we have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. Just to cap it off, we threw in the police brutality, the George Floyd, the protests, and these constant images of us being dehumanized, being treated like animals, dragged through the streets. We have economic uncertainty on top of it, a financial strain. A lot of us don't know what's going on with our jobs or where we're going to be or how we're going to pay bills. We have the presidential election coming up, and all that uncertainty and stress that comes with that. And then for those of us that have kids, and I love my children dearly, I really do, but having them at home every day while I'm trying to work, and it's wonderful on one hand, but on the other hand, there are days where I wish I could send them just somewhere, school, daycare, somebody take them. So there's a lot of stress, and that's not even looking at the homeschooling and making sure my kids' education is great. And then on top of all that, we have incidents of overt racism, where people feel more and more comfortable talking, saying things, treating people, not just African Americans, but, you know, Jews, Muslims, Asians. It's okay apparently now to do and to treat people in a rude way and in a racist way. It's apparently acceptable because from the top it's acceptable. So all these things, when you put them together into this mixture, it's clearly impacted our mental health. And even if I didn't have statistics, we know it because we're seeing it every day. We're feeling it ourselves. What we've seen though is that African Americans in particular, our numbers for anxiety and depression jumped in the week after the George Floyd video. And what's interesting is apparently they were doing the census and a mental health census, and then the George Floyd thing happened at the same time, and they literally saw our anxiety and depressive symptoms as a community just spike. And even before that, anxiety and depression symptoms have tripled since 2019. And again, as with a lot of things, our community tends to shoulder a lot of that burden. And then one of the questions I had is, well, what are people doing? We're sitting at home drinking. Like, well, not me. But again, we talk about self-medication. And we're at home, as Dr. Tony said, we're isolated. We can't go out and be with our friends and go to church and do it. So people fall back on the coping skills that are available. And unfortunately, one of those coping skills is an increase in alcohol use. So what I've seen as a clinician is that we are struggling, and Dr. Tony again touched on this, with a lot of our available coping strategies we just can't do. As a therapist, I talk about, you know, not isolating yourself, getting out with your community, spending time with your friends, going to church, going to support groups. Even Alcoholics Anonymous or your addiction support groups can't meet in person right now. That's on Zoom, and all of us don't function well through a screen. I know. I'm not one of these people. I need to be around people. And something that I haven't heard a lot of people talking about, but I think is especially impactful in our community, is being separated from our elders. Our elders in our community are so important. They're the cornerstone. And right now, we can't be around them. We can't go to church and talk to our church mothers or talk to our church fathers or our grandparents. And we all know how comforting it is to be able to talk to these folks that have been through it. They've been through it, and they can sit there and tell you everything's going to be okay, or we've gone through this before, you're going to be, and for our community especially, that's so important. And right now we literally cannot do it. And that is also very difficult. And it's hard to help people find appropriate coping skills with everything that's going on. And all these things are impacting everybody, but I believe that it's even more so impacting our community.
Thank you.
No problem.
I really appreciate what you said, Maisha, about this, you know, what the current environment is. I was thinking about this, and I was, you know, just kind of relating to this from a perspective, as you said, from a transgenerational, hundreds of years of trauma that now just got the wound just ripped wide open. That not only was this country, you know, in denial about this, and acknowledging the pain and suffering of people of color, as well as, you know, immigrants, as well as women, you know, as far as sexism, misogynist attitudes, policies, and it reached I guess a critical mass with this when George Floyd's murder was shown to the whole country, and when we were in what is it, social distancing and kind of staying in place. So there was no way to turn away from it and avoid it. Everybody had to deal with it and saw it over and over again. Very much kind of remind me of like 9/11, when those planes with passengers went into the Twin Towers and into you know, the field in Pennsylvania. And when people just kept watching that over and over and over again, there was a couple of things that were experienced. One, the impact was the greatest on the people that were in the closest proximity to where those acts of terrorism occurred. So people that were in New York were impacted in a much more severe way in New York City than maybe people in California. And also just the constant, you know, looping of that over and over again, you know, was traumatic to watch. And people had to say, I can't watch it anymore. I have to stop. And I feel that this is what African American and people of color who have been oppressed, couple of things have happened is that now it's all in the media and it's all everybody is covering and talking about. And it's almost like, well, where were you all when we were telling you that? You know, like, what now? So now I'm feeling a certain kind of way now. I don't know what to feel about this now. Like, do I want this attention? Do I want your compassion or your concern? Or is this just something that's going to pass when the news cycle is over, when you move on to the next thing, when you go back to work, when you get back into, you know, the world as we knew it before the pandemic? So there's a trust and there's a issue about, well, I don't know how much I really want to open up and talk about this, but yet there are people who are trying to, of all races and people of particularly you see a lot of the protesters are people, Caucasian people who are out there, and they're going hard. They are really going hard about this. And, you know, I appreciate the energy and I appreciate the commitment, but after it's all said and done, we're the ones that are going to have to deal with whatever the results or the outcomes are. It seems like disproportionately we'll bear the brunt of this. It's like, it still looks like it's Black Lives Matter. So it's really about the protesting and the rioting and everything that's going on that is being overstated and blown out of proportion. You know, when they think of rioters, looters, they don't think, who do they think of? Who are they referring to? So all the policies and all the political consequences and all the police and legal system and responses, even though white people get tear gassed, but Black people live with the residual shock and pain of all these reactions and perceptions and stories and mistruths that are being spun by certain media organizations and certain outlets. So the problem as I'm thinking about it is that it's become so heightened and so politicized, and it's painful. It's painful for people of color because this has been our history, and now we have to face it and have to relive it. And a lot of it is probably not even things that we are wanting to think about. It's being triggered, and it's creating a sense of like the distress of danger, fear, worry about our children, our young Black males, our family, our older Black males, our women. We're fearful for all of them. We're fearful for all of them. We're concerned about all of them. So I think that the church, I think it's important to know that, to realize that although people may seem like they're okay, they may be just numb and just in shock and just kind of experiencing either a sense, just because they're not reacting and expressing themselves, but it may be like part of their survival, fight, flight, or freeze response to everything that's happening around us in this world, and trying to cope with it. So I would just say that, we have to realize that trauma gets triggered, and it doesn't necessarily have to look like what you've experienced, but it's something that's in our bones. We've carried this trauma, this racial and injustice and inequity and inequality and dehumanization in us that we have inherited from our prior ancestors, and that we carry those scars, we carry those wounds, we carry those pains. So it doesn't take a lot to really trigger a reaction or response to that. So, it doesn't matter where you live, whether you're in the suburbs or whether you're in the inner city. Trauma does not know zip codes. It does not know neighborhoods. It doesn't know religion, gender, sexual orientation, or age. It's equal opportunity, in that if you have experienced or if you've been born into a history and a culture of oppression, discrimination, violence, dehumanization, these things have left its mark, and it can look so, it's individual, it's unique to each person, and I think that we just have to be aware of that and understand those impacts, and begin to have this conversation, or give people a place to have conversations, support, to come and just listen, to be heard, to allow them to vent, to allow them to release the worries and concerns, and know that it's okay, that it's understandable, that nothing wrong with them, and that that this is something that we're going to be dealing with for a long time. So let's be prepared, and let's have our churches and our ministries kind of prepared and committed to staying in this for the long haul, because the people, well, we need each other. Not only do they need us, but we need them too. We need each other to get through this. So just wanted to add that as well, just my personal thoughts on what's happening and what we need to be aware of right now going on in this country.
Thank you. So there's another question that is related to what you were just talking about, Professor Robinson. And the question is, what is the role of pastors and lay church leaders in the efforts as we move forward in dealing with mental illness?
Well, I think the role of pastors is to, because becoming aware of this, is to kind of rethink ministry a little bit differently, to be more intentional and to create ministry opportunities and groups to perform outreach to people, to members, and to form connections and links to mental health services and resources, and invite the mental health community into become a part of an appendage or extension of your ministry, and have mental health providers that may be part of the congregation to kind of help facilitate and to assess, to evaluate, and to refer or treat as necessary, but to kind of make this a relationship. You know, that leadership of churches, you know, are being proactive and establishing relationships with mental health, and as well as providing maybe even like manuals or resource lists for treatment for people. And something that I don't know if some churches have done is they've been taking mental health first aid training for churches and leaders to kind of get familiar and to understand, you know, what mental health issues and certain disorders look like, and, you know, check in with each other. I mean, identify people who have not seen or have isolated or have changes in behavior or not coming to church anymore. It's just the fact that paying attention more and recognizing that people are dealing with, all of us are dealing with a lot we got a lot emotionally and a lot of pressure and stress. So I would say that ministry should be doing outreach and understanding that people feeling very isolated, especially during COVID-19, but even prior to this, some surveys have indicated or shown that almost half of the people that were surveyed said they had either one or less friends, that people that they can consider a friend or close that they could go to. And the Bible talks about that. It says, you know, Proverbs says that there is a friend who is closer than a brother. And is the church doing that? Is the church identifying and recognizing that there are people who are separated from loved ones for various reasons, and they have no one else to turn to? So just looking for these things and being thoughtful and intentional, and realizing that people are probably not sharing it or talking about it, but they are experiencing things. And finally, I would say that also respect confidentiality in churches. If people tell you something and share something with you, to not, you know, get permission or consent if they want you to reveal it or share it with other people. But also understanding the limits to confidentiality, what those limits are as far as child abuse, abuse of elders, suicidal thoughts or intent to commit suicide or harm oneself, or intention to hurt and harm someone else. But I just think that opening up and making themselves more available, accessible to people, and letting them know and being transparent about, hey, everyone's going through something. And those are really important conversations that could be very healing for people to have a place to talk about things like that.
I would like to add to Professor Robinson's statement. The question, I love the question, right? The question is asking us, what signs should pastors and leaders look for concerning mental illness? How should we respond, and when should someone be referred to a professional? That's what you had asked, right, JoAnna? That we were on that question. So
That was a part of the question, but you can move forward with that question because
okay. No, I'm going to
it's
answer.
connected. It's connected. So move forward. Thank you.
I'm going to answer the question on a more global perspective. I think that before pastors can move into caring, because I believe that the pastorate is about, the major calling is caring for the sheep, caring for the people. And before they could actually move into something like this, mental health, I think the most critical barrier to get through is this taboo. I mean, if you read articles and books, and the majority of pastors rarely speak of mental illness to their congregations. It's just never a topic of discussion. And so there are three major reasons why this taboo even exists. Number one, as I stated before, the stigma. You know, what does it mean for someone in my church, if I'm a pastor, to have mental illness? You know, the stigma comes also from our cultural and conditioning of our own minds and what we have been erroneously taught to believe about this taboo for many, many years, right? Also, most pastors are not prepared. They're just not prepared professionally, maybe even emotionally, and to breach this topic and actually feel uncomfortable to approach the topic of mental illness. So then the question for me becomes, what is it that we need to understand then? How do we understand this massive, ever evolving problem? So, we need to understand, pastors, I love what Professor Robinson stated, about teaching. I call it training the trainers, right? The people that are in the trenches with the congregants and the members and the sheep, they need to be trained. Many people who have mental illness, they don't even want to talk about it because of the stigma. But mental illness, if they're able to be explained, that mental illness literally is nothing to be ashamed about, even though it is very shame-provoking. It is. That's why people say, I don't need therapy. I don't need anybody telling me anything about, because it's the shame. It's not that they're trying to be, I'm just going to speak Bronx Stilo, big and bad about what they feel. They're scared. And if they were to only understand that it's a medical condition like a heart disease, diabetes, and can be treated. Pastors also need to know more about how the brain can work and treatments. I know that we're not looking to turn our pastors into clinicians unless they go through a clinical program, as many of us here have done. But there are layman trainings so that they can at least know how to successfully navigate through mental illness in the church. And then, to teach the congregation that you will not be discriminated against because of this situation, okay, of your mental status. And so when mental illness does occur in the church, we need to first we need to know. And I think, I have a saying that I've never read anywhere. If any of you clinicians have heard it, all right, go ahead and disappoint me and tell me, no, Dr. Tony, I've heard that before. But I believe that God is raising up a new breed of therapists, of counselor, people that authentically love their clients, people that struggle through their own lives, like my sister Maisha just mentioned before about her own trajectory and her journey right now, you know, but she is moving in, she is doing it. You know, I do it on the academic level, and it's still not easy, you know, but God is raising up a new breed of counselor and therapists that, you know, that can be used for kingdom purpose. And you know what? We at Nyack College right now, Dr. Orozco and I, have been planning some kind of webinar, you know, mental health in the church webinar to put on our website. We want to tackle specific topics like depression, anxiety. We've even talked about pornography during this time in the church. We got to be real about what's really happening to our people. They're looking for outlets to feel better, right? And so we want to tackle, we're not ashamed and afraid to tackle these very hard topics, because guess what? If people don't hear about it, they won't know how to manage it. And I, for one, you know, as a dean of a mental health counseling program, I feel very accountable for what I know, what I've been trained in, and what I can disseminate. Maybe not to the world, but maybe just to my urban community, you know? So we're working on that, and or at least we're gonna be working on that, because I don't see this changing very soon. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I agree with a lot of what you said. And Dr. Orozco, I would like to ask you your thoughts about training the trainers, which means training the pastors. How do we help equip the pastors with what they need in order to deal with the individuals that come through their door? Because to be honest with you, people in the congregation feel more comfortable going to talk with their pastors than they would a counselor.
Absolutely.
So how do we help them move forward in helping individuals receive what they need, as well as helping to equip the pastors?
Absolutely. One of the things that, and it's been said already, is folks that go and get a seminary training don't necessarily get the training in counseling.
Right.
I've done a little research on that. I've looked at prominent seminaries across the country and in other countries. And if someone in seminary is in a program that requires them to take a counseling course, sometimes it's just an elective, or sometimes it's one course, an introductory course. And when you look at the role of the pastor, they do premarital counseling, they do couples counseling, they do all kinds of counseling, grief counseling. And so I think one of the pieces there is just for there to be an acknowledgement that in formal seminary training, the counseling piece isn't as highlighted. And so perhaps saying for the pastor, the onus to be on the pastor to say, I need to seek out some more tools for my tool belt. I think another piece to that would be for the pastors to build their network, just like they know other pastors, they know other worship leaders. I think to connect with folks that are in the mental health space and to build relationships with them, folks that you've done life with, so that you can feel comfortable bouncing an idea off. I have this church member that came, they brought this issue. What are your thoughts on it? I think having these relationships where they can check in and have a friend in their corner that can say, you know what, Pastor, I think this elevates to the level of something clinical. Perhaps you should refer, and someone that will be able to do a good job of referring out. There's also a level of humility. You know, my father's a pastor, and I grew up in a Latinx culture. And in the Latinx culture in church, you go to the pastor for everything. Like, pastor, like, I got a flat tire, they call the pastor. When I was a little kid, I would say, why don't they call a mechanic? Or if they were like, pastor, such and such thing happened. And to me, it was like, it's so unrelated to church stuff. And that was me as a little kid. But I think that puts certain pressure on the pastor to feel like they have to be the one. They have to know everything. They have to know how to deal with everything that comes their way, because you don't want to come across as incompetent. But I encourage all of the folks that are in a shepherding role to embrace a spirit of humility and even model for our church members in saying, you know what, this goes beyond pastoral counseling, and it's entering the space of clinical issues, and therefore I'm going to refer out because that isn't my specialty. And that sometimes can be hard to say, but I think it's the ethical thing to say. And when we're putting the people or clients or our parishioners first, then I think that elevates that, and then the onus would be on the pastor in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I had a thought as Dr. Orozco was talking. As therapists, we consult. You know, we have supervisors, even if you're independently licensed, even if you're a PhD, there are a lot of times cases that will come up, and we will sit down with another clinician in our office or somewhere else and discuss this situation, discuss this case. What do you do? What do you think? All those things. And just like he said, it makes sense. I think humility is very important, but even, you know, doctors consult, medical doctors consult, psychologists consult, we all consult and talk to other people, bring in different perspectives. So I think it's important for pastors to have that, you know, not feel that lessens them in any way to consult with someone else, especially a mental health professional. I did have some other thoughts. Is this an okay time can I continue?
To make a shift?
Well, no, and along the same lines as what everyone else was saying. I had, when we were talking about the, hold on one second. Why won't it go to my slideshow? View. I don't know. It's okay. Anyway, when we were talking about the role of the church, and I don't know why all of a sudden everything is acting up, but that's okay. We will press on.
And speaking of pressing on,
Yes.
there a few people have asked if we would be able to have access to your PowerPoint. So I'm hoping that once we finish, you will be able to send it in to the National Association of the Church of God, and maybe they will have a way to get it to our audience.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Definitely. I'm not sure why all of a sudden it doesn't want to do slideshow, but that's okay. So I had this slide up, and it struck me, especially when Dr. Orozco and Professor Norman were talking, it's not the load that breaks you down, it's the way that you carry it. And Dr. Tony had mentioned this earlier as well when she talks about the stigma. And when I think about the role of the church and the role of leadership and of pastors, I think it's really, really important for them to make sure that there's no stigma. And some church, I don't know, my church doesn't do this, but you know, some churches may not discourage people from getting mental health treatment, but at the same time, they may not acknowledge that it's out there, that it's an option. And that's important also, because when you don't talk about something, when it's not addressed by leadership, people will draw their own conclusions. So it may not be that, your leadership is saying, hey, don't go get help. But if it's not coming from the pulpit, if it's not coming from leadership, if conversations aren't being had, if sermons, if things aren't being mentioned, then people are going to kind of figure it out for themselves and draw their own conclusions. And they may be wrong conclusions. So there has to be reassurance that it's okay to get help. There's no shame in getting help. this is a legitimate issue, this is a real issue, and that, you know, there are people that can help. Conversations on a regular basis about therapy, about treatment. And I have to give a shout out to my church, Arlington Church of God. We are very good at doing this. Our leadership is very good at having conversations on a regular basis about mental health. We have, just like churches, we focus on our blood pressure. We have health fairs. We talk about, you know, the fasting and eating healthy and all exercising and all those things. We can offer education on mental health, mental wellness, and prevention. And I think a couple people have mentioned having like a resource guide or names of people or practitioners or agencies that we can refer people to if we see something that's troublesome or troubling, or maybe it would help if you talk to somebody else about this. And I'm really glad that I think it was Professor Norman said this, but confidentiality is so important. It's so important for someone to get the courage up to come to someone at the church and share something that is so painful or so shameful or something that they haven't told anybody else. And for that confidentiality to be, you know, gossiped about or, you know, not treated carefully, that can be so damaging. And so I can't stress enough how important being, you know, confidential and respectful of the things that people get the courage up to share within the church. That can be so damaging when that's not respected and when it doesn't happen. So I'm really glad someone else said that also, but that was one of the thoughts that I had that I've heard from people that I've seen, from clients that I've seen, that it can discourage them from ever talking to someone else about it again or trying to get help. So again, that's my, those are my thoughts, just kind of adding on to what everybody else had to say.
Thank you. Another question came in, and the question is, how does the church care for the mental health of our pastors? The stigma is even greater for them. Thoughts?
Well, I was, like Dr. Orozco was saying about his experience and his father and his culture and church of calling the pastor and expecting, like, the pastor is supposed to be available 24/7 and that I only want to talk to the pastor. That I think is a big concern and a major step in caring for the pastor's mental health. Pastors need to establish boundaries, right? They need to create boundaries. And, you know, anyone that's ever read anything from Pete Scazzero about emotionally healthy spirituality is really, he's very, very transparent about how, you know, he was losing because he was unhealthy, and he couldn't say no to people, you know, wanting to please everybody, and neglected his own emotional well-being and even worse, his family, his children, his wife. You know, he was in a real crisis. So I think that, you know, those boundaries need to be established. I mean, that needs to be part of, you know, pastors and church boards and elders and everyone else need to insist that, no, pastor, you know, if the pastor isn't able to say no, that people look out for the pastor and his family. When's the last time you and your family have been on vacation? When have you guys, you know, just taken some time to yourselves? You know, checking in and making sure that pastor is doing okay, and that he or she is, you know, is because you want them for the long haul. You know, the idea is not to burn them out, or as I said, as we know, the number of people leaving the ministry it's startling the number that are just leaving ministry because it's too much. So I think that we need to start with and the pastor sets the tone and example. So if the pastor is setting boundaries and taking care of himself or herself and their families and practicing self-care, as Maisha said, that would really, actions do speak louder sometimes than words. So it's like, it's great to have the words, and I agree with Maisha. Pastors need to fill in the gaps for people and make it very plain, you know, what they, how they feel about mental health, and stop, as Dr. Orozco saying, is humble themselves and admit you can't do it all. And it's bad health, and it's also bad theology to think that a pastor is capable of doing what only God can do, and what God allows us and empowers us to do, which is we're problem solvers, and that we're supposed to do these things in community, in relationship, not in isolation or being codependent with, you know, a pastor or some other spiritual leader. That codependency, those issues around codependency also need to be, you know, addressed as well.
I'd like to just add to that, that Professor Robinson just spoke. One of the things that we as clinicians do, and I think Maisha mentioned something about this, you know, our own supervision as clinicians. You know, sometimes we, and I can almost bet anything that pastors also go through vicarious trauma. And, you know, sometimes as therapists and, you know, people that are working with others, we experience our own traumas through the traumas of our clients. And so one of the most ethical things that a clinician can do is for themselves, in self-care, by the way, is to be supervised by another clinician. And, you know, I think that same modality can expand into the pastorate. You know, if they were to develop or create maybe small groups where pastors can actually talk about what they're going through, how they're feeling about it, and how it's affecting them. And then possibly just go around the, you know, like a round table, and try to figure out, you know, ways to ameliorate the matters and the issues that they're experiencing. But that's one of the things that I've always experienced in church, is this communication barrier. You know, nobody wants to talk, nobody wants to say anything. And I'm gonna just be very honest, that comes out of pride. It's a pride. Yes, it could be shame. It could be a lot of different emotions, but, you know, sometimes it is pride. And because we have these positions, I mean, my staff and my faculty know me. I'm an open book. You know, when I'm feeling it, I am feeling it. And if I have to call one of them and kind of get supervision through them, you know, helping me see where I'm at and what I could possibly do, I don't have a problem with that. Because, you know, even with all the training that we have, like between the four of us here, trust me, we still need each other. We need each other. Pastors need each other. And, you know, their wives can't be that person all the time. They need other pastors, other men and women in leadership to help teach them how to navigate through what they're going through.
You know what,
Thank you.
Dr. Tony, just to piggyback on that, when you were talking, I was thinking about when we do supervision and we're frustrated, or a lot of times when you're burning out, you don't recognize it yourself. We don't recognize it. And sometimes it's that other person, it's that other clinician when you're sharing or you're talking about cases, or they know you and they say, you know what, you're not okay right now. And if pastors were able to, and I'm sure there's some that do, work together and meet and support each other, then they could point out to each other, like, hey, when's the last time you took some time off? Time off. So that kind of made me think about, your point made me think.
Thank you for that.
Darkness here. My flashlight just went out. I apologize. This is crazy.
Dr. Orozco, you were going to add to that?
Yes, Dr. Tony had mentioned vicarious trauma, and I also wanted to add on top of that compassion fatigue.
Yeah.
You're in a role where you care for so many people, for so many different needs, and you start to reach a point where you can't care anymore. And it's not because you're not a caring individual or you're a bad pastor. It's that we have a finite capacity for the amount of things that we can carry at one time. And so I think that's something to be attuned to. The next thing that was mentioned was having perhaps cohorts of other pastors, because you want to be able to sometimes debrief with someone that gets it. And I don't want to get into this whole explanation of liminal space, but that would be something to look into. You ever noticed military people, even if they're from different eras and different branches, when they get together, there's an affinity because they've been through something difficult together. And it's not just the military, folks that have cellmates, been in prison, or people that have gone through like a natural disaster. These issues, these very tough seasons, build community. And so if you were to look into liminal space, you'll see how being in a space of flux sometimes, and the people that are with you in those seasons become so close to you. And I think that being able to sometimes just vent it out with someone that gets it, the uniqueness of that role of a leader among equals is therapeutic in and of itself. I think the congregation can show extreme grace to pastors. And I want to add, even just in this COVID time, a lot of churches that were not already doing online stuff have been violently shoved into doing online stuff. And so now the pastor doesn't just have to exegete and worry about preaching. Now they got to know how to run the light. They got to know how to record. They got to know how to edit. They got to know how to do all this stuff, how to increase engagement online. And now you have to be an AV tech expert now if you don't have a team, right? Depending on your church's situation. So there's a lot, even just in this season. So showing grace, Professor Robinson talked about boundaries, and pastors sometimes feel bad setting boundaries depending on different personality, sensitivities, culture, etc. But setting those boundaries is key. And when board members and elders empower the pastor to do so, encourage him to do so, I think can lift some of that burden. I also would say for pastors to delegate. We see Moses talking to Jethro, and Jethro was like, man, you can't do all of this by yourself. You need to delegate. And that requires trusting your leadership. They might not do it exactly like you would do it, but for the sake of your mental health, it could be a good thing. And then the last thing I would say is managing our expectations of pastors. A lot of times, Jesus is God's son, and sometimes they expect the pastor to be like his nephew, like unreal expectations of the pastor or the pastor's spouse or of the pastor's kids. And there's this whole image and there's all the things that come along with that would just exacerbate mental health issues. So it would be my contribution to that question.
And I just wanted to add one more thing that none of us have said. There's nothing wrong with a pastor going to therapy. I know that it can be difficult sometimes because sometimes the pastors know so many people. So it can even be hard for a pastor to find a therapist that, they're not worried about knowing too much about, or maybe that can be difficult, but it's possible, especially now that, like Dr. Orozco said, we've kind of been shoved, dragged, kicking and screaming into video therapy, which I was, Zoom and whatnot. There's plenty of options for finding a good therapist. Maybe not from your community, maybe not even from your state. So that it's also an option. We haven't talked about it, but it's something to be considered.
Definitely. Thank you for that. So just to sum that up, it sounds like pastors need a support system. A support system that they definitely can trust and reach out to as needed, as well as being able to delegate amongst their staff is really important, it sounds like. So thank you for that. So our time is going really quickly. So I have another question that is specifically for Professor Robinson. As a mental health professional and a person who works with men, what would you say about men and their readiness to seek help when struggling with mental health?
That's a great question. Men, I guess I would defer to Dr. Orozco on the clinical and the psychology and neurobiology, but generally men in general are not really aware of feelings, our own feelings and the feelings of other people. So what I mean by that is that I think the way boys are socialized, we are socialized to deny that we feel any kind of pain, starting with physical pain, that we can't cry, we can't ask for help, we can't say that something hurts because it's just not the way we're wired. So that builds over a period of time in our growth and our development. And if you add like trauma, and you add neglect and trauma, and other stress and pressures and family dysfunction and chaos, it's not surprising that when we become men, young men and older, that we have never learned the skills or learned a language of how to talk about feelings and talk about ourselves and our needs. So I kind of put it like, when it comes to performance and competition and achievement and reputation, our brains are like a super highway. But when it comes to feelings about ourselves, we're like a single lane dirt road. So we can't, it's not that men don't want to talk, it's just that men don't know how to talk. Because in my program where I work, I talk to over 500, 600, 700 men in a year, and they talk, they're willing to talk, they want to talk. It often takes a crisis or a disaster to get them to the point where they recognize that they need to talk. But even then it's hard because they tend not to do it consistently. They don't understand that it's an ongoing process, and it has to be a new skill, a set of skills and behaviors to develop the ability to have relationships with people. Because often what men struggle, or men get into a crisis and they have no place or no one to turn to, because we tend to isolate ourselves and be the lone wolf. We won't, and excuse me for saying this, but I would often say that we won't say crap if we had a mouthful of it. We're just not going to say anything. We will suffer in silence. And I've done that myself, and I'm learning. It's hard. Knowing what I know, it's still hard for me to reach out and say, I need help. I will still, tendency is to try to solve it and figure it out myself, but I'm working on that. I'm doing a lot more, I'm a lot more aware of that. and I'm trying to do better so that relationships are important for our survival. Men die because they don't have relationships. People leave them. People abandon them, or they abandon people when they don't understand, or when things get overwhelming to them. So I believe that it's a work in progress. I think that we just have to start early with men and begin to give them opportunities to talk, to communicate. I think it used to happen just kind of organically in past times, and when society and the culture was a lot slower. I think, like, the idea of the barbershop is, going down to the shop, that's where men used to congregate, and men would talk, and they would share information with each other and help each other through any problems or any kind of issues, like, oh, you're having problems at home again, huh? So, how do you get along? What do you do? Well, I just go out and take a walk, so men would kind of train up other men and be there as mentors and role models. I just think that's what's lacking. I mean, these things should just be happening somewhat organically, but they're not, because of isolation, distancing, separation, and, just kind of, we don't know anybody anymore. We don't know the people we live around. We tend to, for various reasons, we go home, we go to work, we go home, and we shut the door, and we don't have a sense of community anymore. So now people isolate, they stay to themselves, they use technology, social media, and other ways of distracting themselves, but do not have the reinforces a sense of being alone and not reaching out and engaging with other people. So, I think it's just, men just need to be more visible. We have to be more, the church, the men in the church need to reach out, and as well as women in church, and just start reaching out and just, forming connections and bringing men in and inviting them into whatever, draw them in with whatever it is, games, basketball, whatever, to get men to get together and to be part of something in a community, and not just isolate and stay to themselves. So I hope I answered that question, because there's a lot of issues with men, but I just feel that men, when they get to that point where they have no place to turn, they're pretty willing to talk and open up. I just want to intervene and get them, engage with them before it gets to that point where they have nobody else.
Thank you for that.
Definitely agree with what Professor Robinson just shared. I did just want to put out a book called Real Boys by Dr. William Pollack. It's an old book, but it does a really good job of showing how masculinity is taught when we gender stereotype, and especially when it comes to emotions. Most of the time when you, for boys that and then later on become men, the acceptable gradient for a man's emotions is usually, I'm good or I'm angry. I'm good or I'm tight. And that's as far as the gradient goes. But for girls, it is a very young, it starts very young. It's acceptable to have the whole gamut in between, frustrated, elated, downtrodden, downcast, you get the whole gradient. And so for guys, it's established early on, you're good or you could be angry. And the thing with anger is that it's never a primary emotion. Anger is always covering the true emotion underneath, right? Because anger is something that you don't have to explain. You don't have to verbalize, like what Professor Robinson was saying. You just you get angry, you shut down the conversation, or you leave, no explanation. But anger is covering up other primary emotions, and that requires to express it. And then the part of our brain that deals with how we're feeling isn't the same part of our brain that deals with the verbal part. And so there's these pieces that are at work there. I think also to realize that for men, it's easy to talk about topics that are external to themselves, We would talk about fishing, the weather, the basketball game, but about me and what's going on with me, there's a challenge there, unless you're doing something. If you're building something with your friend or working on something with your friend, then it just kind of flows. Hey, what's going on with you? What happened? Or guess what happened to me, right? But being able to kind of diffuse that attention. So I think those are some things to think about. I mean, and if we put this within a church context, how has men's ministry typically, when it, back in the day, it was, let's read a book. Let's read a book and then let's get together. And then let's get together and talk about how we feel, right? I mean, it's just from a ministerial perspective, we have to know our audience. We have to know that if the focus of the conversation is an external one, you have a better chance of getting to those internal things. So just wanted to piggyback a little bit there with what Professor Robinson had said.
Can I just also, I recently had a meeting with my team of counselors. They're peer recovery counselors who are certified. They were former people who had substance use disorders, and now they're counseling. And so we were talking, I was explaining to them that the things that will impact the recovery and their potential for relapse was their inability or their struggles around relationships and having healthy relationships, meaning the ability to understand what other people, how other people feel, as well as themselves. So for example, I said to them, I said, how many men have had divorces because their wife said to them, you're never home, you're never with us as a family. And the man was like saying, but I work 70 hours so that I can buy you things and provide for the family. And I had a guy recently said to me, after 30 years, he just had a relapse, and he said, he was, the first thing he wanted to talk about was his work. What a great job he's been doing at work. And I said to him, I said, that's not what this is about. And he said, my wife used to tell me for 30 years that I would live in a tent and ride a bicycle if you would be home and be present more. But all he wanted to do and how he saw himself is that he could not tell them that he was suffering with anxiety and bipolar. So the way he dealt with it, the only peace he found emotionally and mentally was working. He would work himself 70, 80 hours a week because that was the way he treated his anxiety and his bipolar. And so that's a case, another example where we unable to seek or ask for help. Meanwhile, the people around us are telling us, you've got to change. This is not what we signed up for. We want you, not, yeah, we want the stuff. That's what, we expect you to go out and work, but when you're never here. And when you are here, you're too tired, distracted, and not present. So when I explained that to my staff, 2 of them said to me, oh my God, now I know why my wife divorced me. I never understood that. And he was able to call his wife and apologize. And she says, let's have dinner and talk. So it was like, it's not that people are not trying, it's just they don't know how to engage and how to think and how to relate to other people's feelings, because there's so much that they hide and cover of their own needs and their own insecurities or perceived weaknesses that they don't want anybody to know about. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you. So we're going to begin to wrap up. We have a lot more questions that we don't have time to get to, but I want to begin to wrap up and just ask our panelists for any final words. And what would you suggest to those who need to get help in the area of mental illness for themselves or for a loved one? We know that students are in the midst of returning to school, some of them, and there are a lot of anxieties that the children are carrying and the students are carrying, what would you suggest for parents, for families, to help through this difficult time? That's a loaded wrap-up question, I'm sorry. But what would you say?
You know, JoAnna, part of me, yeah, I worked as a bilingual school psychologist for about 10 years, and I get it. I get the importance of engaging children, teenagers, you know, adolescents. I mean, I don't have any small children any longer, but I get the parenting dilemma that's happening right now, and it is daunting. It's almost like there's no answer. I mean, yes, we know Jesus is the answer for the world today, right? We know that. But speaking on a, you know, just on a level of living through this pandemic, and, you know, I almost feel like we're forcing our rationales on our lives. You know, we feel the need to hang on to what was, and this is a new normal. This is an absolutely new normal. I want to dare say that I think that we need to start learning a new language. You know, we need to start learning how to help our children navigate through this very real, traumatic time in the world. It's not just New York, it's in the world. But I think we're trying to hold on to what was, which then prevents us from moving into what needs to be. Mm-hmm. What it needs to be. You know, we can't keep trying to rationalize our former lives, you know, prior to COVID-19, and try to convince our children that, you know, I don't even know. I don't know what parents are saying, but even for myself, you know, this is real.
Yeah.
This is very, very real. And I think the best thing we can do is help our children navigate through this new normal and reality. And what does that mean? Listen, in this society, we, you know, millennials, children today, we are raising them to be entitled. I get everything. I want everything. So, you know, and this is not a time for that. This has been a halt to that kind of mentality. And so rather than trying to make up all the losses for our children, I think it's time to start teaching them about this new reality, and that right now we cannot live the way we lived. We have to be so much more cognizant about our neighbors, our grandmothers, our grandfathers, and even our people that we surround ourselves with in a supermarket or wherever. I don't know if that made sense, but I just feel like we're just trying to fit a circle into a square peg, and we're literally beating ourselves up, and instead of really, really addressing the real issue, which happens to be a new normal for as long as God says it is. None of us are in control, but we're living in a new normal. It doesn't feel good. I'll be the first to say it don't feel good, but we're in it. We're in it. So how do we navigate through it and make sense? And I think we need to start teaching our children and our adolescents this, as opposed to trying to make it all nice and you know, for them.
Any other comments?
I would say from a, in terms of resources that are out there, there are quite a few resources that are available that a lot of people aren't aware of. For our kids, we talked about going back to school. That's assuming they're going. I just found out last week mine will not. They will be home with me. Pray for me, please. Anyway, I spaced out there for a second. I'm gonna bring it back. But at schools, a lot of schools now have counseling services or agencies that come in and offer therapy and counseling at the schools. And a lot of parents don't know that. You know, we're used to the guidance counselor or the school psychologist, but there are many agencies that will offer therapy and counseling services for kids within the schools. A lot of people forget, those of us that are working, that we have employee assistance programs, and we can call your employee assistance program and get 6 free sessions. You can go online, and if you don't have the time to necessarily leave the house, or you're not able to because you don't have childcare, you can do teletherapy or video therapy. We have community mental health agencies. A lot of times they'll work with you on a sliding scale. One of the things that I was thinking about as I was kind of ruminating over the questions is that I've seen a lot of people, or heard of times where people reach out for help to a therapist or to a counselor, and they have a bad experience, or they get up the courage to talk to somebody and it's not well received, or they're made to feel less than or weak or whatever. And what I would tell you is to keep trying, Don't let one bad experience, or one maybe poor clinician, or someone that's not culturally competent, because we didn't even talk about that. Those of us that go and speak with someone about some of the experiences that we've had, and they look at us like we're speaking in a different language. Don't let that discourage you from talking to somebody else. Just like we try different doctors, we try on shoes till we find a pair that fit. We can try again and find someone that we feel comfortable with. Christian counselors are awesome, but maybe you might feel more comfortable finding a counselor or a therapist that's not a Christian. One of my friends asked me, and it was a really good question. She said, well, how do you feel about seeing someone that's not a Christian counselor? I said, it's just important that they respect your beliefs, and that they don't let their own biases affect the process. So like I said, it's important to find someone that's a good fit and explore your options, because there are a lot of different ways that we can get help for ourselves and for our families. Even groups, therapy groups, support groups, there's a lot of stuff out there that's available that if you just look, you can find them.
Thank you.
I think my closing remarks would be, one would be a caution to pastors that your mental health not be directly correlated to how ministry is going. So I encourage you to take, there's a longitudinal study done by the Duke University School of Divinity. Pastors, when ministry is going great, their emotional and mental health is great. And when ministry is going tough, their mental health goes down. Those two things can be and should be mutually exclusive. There will be some impact back and forth, but if your mental health is dependent on how the church is doing, now you're on this performance wheel. And so that's something to caution about. The next thing that I'll say is an invitation, and it's an invitation to press into the biblical concept of shalom, the Hebrew concept of shalom, that you might be at peace on every side. That means within yourself, in your spiritual walk, in your ministry, in your home, in your marital relationship, may you press into that shalom that God is offering on every side. The next thing is just a quote from Frederick Douglass, that it's easier to raise strong children than to try to repair broken adults later on. And so in that way, the idea that comes to mind is when you get on an airplane and they tell you, hey, if something goes wrong and the masks fall out of the top of the airplane, they always say, put your mask on first before you go and help your children or whoever else you're traveling with. That's because you need to be well in order to help well. And so that would be some of the just closing remarks that I would have, that you can be in this helping profession and do well to the capacity that you care for yourself. And thank you for letting me be a part of the conversation.
Thank you. Professor?
I thank you all. It's been wonderful being here with everybody. Really learned so much. I think my closing comments would be, Dr. Orozco just said something when he mentioned shalom, the Jewish concept of shalom and peace and wholeness. I would also, because he mentioned it, it just kind of made me think of it, is Sabbath. The idea of observing the Sabbath, a day of rest. If God rested from all that he did, and that he could take a day, how much more for us to take, important for us as finite human beings, to take a day of rest where we're just spending time with our family, and so that the family becomes part of the family kind of practice of Sabbath. And for husbands, an example that might be is like, okay, we're watching a ball game, but are we making a Sabbath possible for our wives? Are we helping them? Are we making sure that they can enjoy Sabbath as well? And so that's not just an individual thing, it's really more of a family and a community thing. That was the Jewish, the concept of shalom, of Sabbath was it's the community. In Israel, everybody shuts down. Nothing is happening. And I think I think in an overstimulated and stressed world, as Dr. Tony was saying, we have to get back to some of the things that worked before we got so full of ourselves and so out of control with a sense of wanting more, doing more, or just getting more, as opposed to the idea of trusting and having faith that God said 6 days you shall work and 1 day you should rest. So I think that my last comment was that God wants us well, and without emotional health and wellness, we are limited in experiencing and fulfilling our divine purpose from God. So without emotional health and emotional wellness and stability, I don't care how much scripture you know, or how much you pray, you're still going to be one spiritual hot mess. So let's be holistic and practice the shalom that Dr. Orozco was saying, and Sabbath, a Sabbath rest. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the panelists for your time this evening and for your insight and knowledge. Where mental health in the church is concerned, we really appreciate it. I also want to thank the National Association of the Church of God for providing this forum. We look forward to continuing this discussion and other relevant topics in the future. So I want to thank you all so much. I also want to give a few reminders for our participants, and just to remind you that we are having tonight's webinar. After tonight's webinar, immediately following, we're having Jimmy Crumley. Yes, and he will be presenting wonderful music through a listening party. And so please join us for that. I also want to remind you to join us tomorrow, which is Wednesday, which starts our first night for virtual camp meeting. Our speaker will be Reverend Dr. Horace Shepherd. Also, I want to just tell our audience there are ways to give to the National Association of the Church of God, and those ways are on the screen currently. So thank you all so much. Dr. Orozco, would you mind closing us out in prayer?
Be a privilege. Lord Jesus, we pause at the end of this great conversation to look to you. We look to the cross, and we acknowledge that at the foot of the cross, the topography is level. I ask, O Lord, for everyone that's under the sound of my voice at this time, that they would experience your refreshing, your renewing, your shalom, rest, Sabbath in you. And as these clergy, as these servants of you, O God, are embarked in this week of spiritual refreshing and also building in new tools into their tool belt, may they continue to experience you in a mighty and powerful way. Refresh them, O God. Revive them towards ministry. I pray, O God, that your spirit would just make them alive again unto you and unto the folks you've called them to serve. And tonight, Lord, as we looked at this topic of mental health, we recall the words of the prophet Isaiah in chapter 9, where one of the names is Wonderful Counselor. Oh God, we need you. We need you. We want to be like you, especially in this area of counseling. Lord, one of the names of the Holy Spirit is the Comforter. Oh God, a lot of times we're in a role and in a space where folks need comforting. I pray that we would experience you first as our counselor and comforter as we seek to do the same to the folks you've entrusted into our care. So Lord, I ask a special blessing over each person on this call tonight and the rest of this conference. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
God bless
Thank you.
you. It was a privilege and an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. God bless you all. Thank you.
God bless. Good night.
Good night.